Hello. It's great to be here. My first time in Moscow. My second time in Russia. My first time I went to Russia, I went to Krasnodar, and it was about 10 years ago, and I went to see some wineries there. And some were brilliant and some were not brilliant. But it was very exciting, very interesting, and so it's good to be here in Moscow. My background is that I started out as a scientist. I spent too long in university. I enjoyed being in university, so I wanted to stay for 3 more years, so I did a PhD, and then I worked for 15 years as a science editor, so I was editing academic science books. And that was really interesting because it gave me a wide literacy across lots of different areas of science. And because I like words, and I started to get a wine habit. I was drinking lots of wine. I found wine really interesting. And this is the interesting thing about wine, because wine it's a drink, yeah? But it grabs a lot of people. And some people, it seems, have this latent interest in the subject of wine. And given the right exposure to interesting wines, then this becomes almost like a very strong intellectual appeal, a very strong love for wine. And otherwise sensible people end up devoting their lives and spending far too much money on wine, traveling too much. And that's been my story, really. I was somebody who discovered wine from a background of science. And for me, that was like something that really drew me in very strongly. And so in about 1999, I started a wine website. This was early days of the internet, as a hobby. And that's what everyone did. Everyone at that stage, when they got the internet, the first thing they did was they put a hobby website up. And my hobby was wine. I was learning quite a bit about it from all the online discussion boards. And I had my scientific background. So I started my website, and then suddenly it took off. I started writing for other people. I got a book deal. I got a newspaper column. And I was doing this in my spare time. And it got to the stage in 2008 where I was able to work full-time on wine. And so for me, wine is something that, first of all, I'm a wine lover. I really love wine, but also now I'm working as a wine professional. And it's such an interesting area. It engages you intellectually on so many levels. And so for me, writing books has been one of the fun things for me. I started out writing a book on wine science, and that was being revised. Then I wrote a book with a colleague called Sam Harrop, who's a master of wine, called Authentic Wine, looking at natural and sustainable winemaking. Because as a scientist, I was very interested in the whole issue of naturalness in wine. And so we wanted to write a book about exploring the whole, what does it mean to make wine naturally? What's an authentic wine? And then I wrote a book at the end called I Taste Red, which is about the perception of wine, because this is the other thing, is ultimately with wine, when we drink wine, we're having an experience, a cognitive experience, and there's some very interesting science looking at how we perceive the world around us, and that includes perceiving flavor. So that was one book, and then most recently a book called Flawless, which is more geeky, but it's an important topic, which is wine faults. And I think the thing for me about wine faults is that when people learn about wine, they learn to identify flaws in wine, and then they become fault policemen, especially winemakers. They'd love to find faults in wine. And I think sometimes the interesting thing about wine is that a perfect wine is not a wine without faults. A perfect wine is much more to wine. So you can have trace elements of some what many consider to be fault compounds, and they can be like beautiful. This Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, where small flaws can actually make us realize the beauty of the wine. So reduction, for instance, just because you can spot some reduction in a wine does not mean the wine is faulty. Some of the most interesting wines in the world have reduction as part of their signature, like Coche or Rouleau, you can't dismiss those wines as faulty. Well, you can, but then you're an idiot, because they're really interesting wines, and they're considered by the community of wine to be fascinating wines. A little bit of Brettanomyces is a flavor compound that if I was making wine, I would want to avoid Brettanomyces altogether, but sometimes a little bit of Brettanomyces is a character in a wine, and some of the many, many famous red wines in the world, especially older Bordeaux, have a bit of Brettanomyces as their flavor signature. So I'm not arguing for wine faults, but I'm just saying that's why I wrote that book. It was partly because I think we need to know more about faults, but we also need to have a more intelligent discussion about what it is, what's beauty in wine. So those are the books. So my quick talk today is going to be a rapid run-through of some of the most interesting scientific aspects of wine. And I'm calling it completing the loop because we start off with viticulture. Obviously, growing wine grapes is one of the key elements to making good wine. Then we've got the decision of when to pick, and I've put this as a separate idea because harvest decisions are absolutely critical in terms of style and quality of the wine. And then we go to the winery. And obviously, wine is made by yeasts and bacteria. So microbes are intrinsic to the quality of wine. But because they're invisible, we don't talk about them much. It's as if they don't get the attention they deserve. But microbes obviously are what make wine. But then obviously in a winery, there are so many decisions that have to be made that affect the quality of the wine. For instance, do you destem or not? What's your pressing like? What's your fermentation temperature? Which vessels are you going to use to ferment the wine? And the aging of the wine. Which vessels are you going to use to age the wine? There's so many decisions that have to be made that affect the style and the quality of the wine. And then we've got finishing the wine and bottling. And that's an area where lots of quality can be lost. If you don't finish the wine properly, or you bottle in bad conditions, or even if you use the wrong closure type, then you can lose quality. And ultimately, when it comes to wine, tasting is the readout. So all of these steps here, all of these different steps here, matter because it affects the way that the wine tastes in the end. And this is where we come to the issue of perception. And often in the wine industry, we think of wine as just a liquid in a glass. But there is so much more to wine quality than just the chemical composition of the wine, the liquid in the glass. It's the stuff around wine that helps bring it to life. It's the stories, it's the culture, it's our expectations, it's the environment in which the wine is consumed. Even the label on the bottle can affect the flavor of the wine, because these things actually affect our own perception of the wine. So many experiments have been done looking at, for instance, in restaurants, how, for instance, the weight of cutlery or the color of the plate or ambient noise and music can actually affect the nature of the perception of the person dining in the restaurant. And in the wine industry, if we understand the actual multimodal the multimodal perception of wine, and we understand how these other factors work in, some of those are very easy wins in terms of making our wines more enjoyable and better in quality. So the liquid in the wine matters, the liquid in the glass, but it's the stuff around wine that also shapes very distinctly how that wine is actually perceived, and in some ways that's a very inexpensive way of improving wine quality. So let's begin. Grapes are for the birds. And I think this is maybe a simplistic thing to say, but I think it actually helps us in the way we think about viticulture. So Vitis sylvestris, this isn't Vitis sylvestris, this is a wild vine in America, but I figured it's the only slide I've got that shows a native vine in its own environment. So wild vines grow up trees. They're woodland climbers. They produce these tiny bunches of grapes. And what's really interesting is the role of sunlight, because as a vine grows, it produces tendrils. Now each of those buds that produces tendrils can also produce a flower cluster instead of a tendril. And the decision about whether to be a tendril or a flower cluster is determined by the amount of sunlight that that bud sees in the previous season. Because obviously, if you're growing in the middle of a wood in a canopy of leaves, you want your grapes to start appearing where the birds can see them. So that will be gaps in the canopy. So the sunlight is saying, produce some fruit here. And originally, before domestication of Vitis vinifera, all grapes would have been red or black because the birds have to see them. So the emergence of white grape varieties came after domestication. And so we can understand something about how we're going to work with vines in a monoculture in a field if we understand about how the vine performs in its woodland environment. And also, when you have a vine establishing itself, it's growing up other plants, it's putting its roots down into the soil where there's already lots of other roots as well. So that's why vine roots are particularly good at sequestering water and mineral salts. Because they're used to performing, they're evolved in a situation where they're competing very strongly with other root systems. So that's something else. So this is why initially grapevines would have been grown in places where you couldn't grow many other crops, in very rocky, stony soils with low fertility. Grapevines quite like that. So the domestication event happened at least 8,000 years ago in the Caucasus. And once you start putting a vine into a field in a monoculture, you're changing the way it grows. You're focusing the energy of the vine on grape production rather than on producing large amounts of canopy. You need a canopy, but you want the grape to decide at the right time, say, right, my energy is going to go into fruit production. And so good viticulture, smart viticulture, is targeting the production of good quantities of healthy grapes. And quantities matter here. We'll come on to yields later. So this is what we're thinking, is how do you manage this plant in this particular environment to produce good quality grapes? And the key thing about viticulture is that you can't use a template. You can't get a Bordeaux consultant to travel to other regions and replicate Bordeaux in other places, because it won't work. It will end badly. For instance, Burgundy. You go to Burgundy, you think, I want to make great Pinot Noir. So you see the Burgundy, you see the low canopies, and you'll see the trained, 30 centimeters from the ground, and you'll think, well, actually, maybe if I want to make great Pinot Noir in California, I need to plant a vineyard that looks just like that. But the problem is, if you try and do that in different soil type and different climate, you can end up with a disaster of a vineyard. And so it's about intelligent application, looking at the site and thinking, how can we manage this grapevine to produce the sorts of grapes we want in this particular condition? So trellising. Some pictures here. This was a few weeks ago in Japan. This is the most extreme viticulture I've seen, where you've got pergolas it's almost like gardening, and each of the bunches of grapes has a little hat on the top, a little rain hat. It's very cute. This is an extreme way of growing wine grapes. The first decision, I think, in viticulture, and this is what's really interesting, is this decision between cane pruning and spur pruning. So if cane pruning, you're laying down a cane. There's some big advantages to cane pruning. And for some varieties, cane pruning is actually the only way you will get any sort of decent yield because of low basal bud fertility. For instance, Sauvignon Blanc, you've got to cane prune that. So Marlborough in New Zealand, in a region where everything is pretty much mechanized, they still have 20,000 hectares of Sauvignon Blanc that they have to cane prune every year, and that has to be done by hand. Spur pruning is easier. Spur pruning, you've got your small shoots. It's much easier to train people to spur prune, but there can be problems there with certain varieties. You've got a larger mass of wood, which is an advantage, a permanent vine architecture, which means you've got more carbohydrate reserves, but then there are other problems with spur pruning so it's a decision that you have to make. That's the first one. Then after that, are you going to have a vertically shoot positioned vine? So vertical shoot positions are very trendy. Everyone likes them. You've got this canopy, this large canopy, lots of photosynthetic energy there. But it doesn't suit all climates. In a warm, dry climate, the bush vine, which is the simplest way of trellising a vine, is often better because, first of all, you don't have the obvious thing is you don't have to put a trellising system in, so you save money. But a bush vine is a really efficient vine when it comes to water use, and you get this dappled light, so you get a little bit of shading, but not too much. And in a warm climate, a bush vine can be the best way to get high-quality grapes. Sometimes you make a sacrifice in yield. In Australia, the traditional way of in warmer climates like the Barossa Valley was to have a single wire, and so the shoots would kind of flop over on either side. They called it umbrella sprawl. Umbrella sprawl looks ugly, it looks very simplistic, but the good thing about it, again, is you get this partial fruit shading. In a hot climate, that's fantastic. And then you've got decisions like the fruit zone management. So this is where it all gets very interesting. So do you strip off the leaves in the fruit zone, leaving the fruit bare? In some climates, it's ideal to do that because you get good airflow, so you get actual some degree of protection against disease. And also it can encourage the ripeness of the grapes. But in a warm climate, you can get some problems with sunburn, so a little bit of shading can be quite handy. And then there's this idea of partial leaf fruit zone removal, which is also something that can be adapted and work very well. In New Zealand, for example, they take machine harvesters down the rows and they blast air with a thing called a collard, and that will fragment the leaves in the fruit zone. So it shatters them a bit, but it doesn't completely remove them. So again, what you're getting is you're getting some airflow, but you're also getting a little bit of protection from the sun, so that the fruit isn't sunburned and damaged in that way. And then there's timing of leaf removal matters as well, because if you do it earlier in the season, the grapes have a chance to build up some sort of sunscreen. The flavonoids in the skin can build up so the grapes are more protected from sunburn. If you do it later, then you can strip it all off and then the grapes get zapped. Row orientation is very interesting as well. So if you're doing the typical north-south row orientation, then you're getting one side that gets the afternoon sun, which is a lot hotter than the morning sun. So these are things you have to bear in mind when you're doing this sort of viticulture. There's lots of decisions that really impact on quality, but they're not simple decisions because they all depend on where you are and the local conditions that you have. So you can't just take a template and apply it around the world. You have to think intelligently. Water relations as well. This is a critical issue in viticulture. Irrigation. There's lots of people who will discuss, can you have terroir when you have irrigation? And some of the famous soil scientists from France, they'll say, well, it's impossible to have terroir and have irrigation. And, well, basically, they've just written off maybe a third of the world of wine. Whereas lots of places where it's simply impossible to grow grapes without some form of irrigation. And generally speaking, you need about 500 millimeters of rain a year to be able to dry grow grapes, but that will depend on the evapotranspirative rate, which is the amount of wind and sun and the conditions during the growing season. It will depend on the timing of the rainfall, and of course it will depend on the water retention properties of the soil. And then once you decide you're going to have irrigation, the old-fashioned way used to be overhead irrigation, or in Mendoza, flood irrigation. So that, in some ways, replicates rainfall a bit better than drip irrigation. Drip irrigation is fantastic because it reduces the amount of water that's used. It's very efficient. But then what you're getting is you're getting a little bit of water quite frequently. So you create a root zone, which is a small ball, which is then, then the roots don't really investigate the soil as fully as they might otherwise. And the vine is then more susceptible to heat spikes because it just doesn't have the resources to produce, to seek out the water where it is. There's a very interesting technique called partial root drying, which is a form of deficit irrigation. So deficit irrigation is very widely practiced because if you look at the great terroirs, there's a very famous study by a scientist called Gérard Séguin, and he published it in 1985 in Bordeaux. And he did a survey of the terroirs in the Médoc, and what he found is that the top terroirs, he thought were top terroirs because of their hydrogeological properties. So what you have is a steady but slow supply of water through the growing season that then tails off just after veraison. So this seemed to be the hallmark of a truly great red wine terroir in Bordeaux. This idea that you have water supply, it's slow and steady, and obviously if you have clay or limestone in the soil, they can sequester water and then deliver it slowly to the roots. And then this idea that the vine should be experiencing some level of deficit after veraison, because then the vine focuses all its energies not on keep on growing the canopy, but then on actually ripening fruit. And this has become an idea that's been widely adopted, this idea that if you're irrigating, don't just give the vine exactly what it wants, keep it in slight deficit, especially later in the season. And so smart irrigation kind of does that. It actually looks at how the vine is experiencing water. So soil probes are not a very good way of doing this. The best way to do it is using pressure bombs to actually look at the actual shoot water potential. And if you can see that, you see how the vine is actually doing. And the problem in many areas is they like their irrigation. Growers like to irrigate lots because they want to get good yields. And the problem is if you build a big canopy early in the season, then it demands more water later in the season, which is when they tend to run out of water anyway. So the real smart irrigation is one where you're actually keeping the vine just at the right place, where it's got just enough water, but then it's not got enough. But the deficit is not so severe that you lose yield or lose quality, but just enough that the vine is focusing all its efforts not on vegetative growth, but on fruit production. And partial root drying was this very interesting idea taken from some research on tomatoes, where the idea being that if you keep if you have a split irrigation system, so on two sides of the vine, and you keep part of the soil in deficit, but you feed the other side of the vine with water, then what's happening is the roots are signaling abscisic acid is being sent from the roots, which is the roots detect when there's a water stress, and they send a hormonal signal up to the shoots of abscisic acid, and the abscisic acid is causing the vine to then to reduce its canopy growth and focus more on fruit production. And yet at the same time the vine isn't suffering a real deficit, so it's almost tricking the vine into thinking it's suffering a deficit because you're keeping the water supplied. Then every now and again you switch the irrigation side and the result is that you're not losing yield, you're getting good quality grapes, the vine's focusing on fruit production. So ideas like this, intelligent application of science, I think are really interesting. And the latest thing I've heard, I was in Central Otago and I saw this in action in a vineyard at Amersfield, was mid-row irrigation. Because when you irrigate in the row, what happens is that any weeds that grow in the row. And that's the hardest place to control weeds. So what some people have done is they've switched their irrigation pipe and not buried it, but just recessed it slightly in the middle of the row. And then what happens is that two benefits. First of all, any weed growth takes place in the row, in the middle of the row, where it's very easy to control, just mow it if you want to. It also means you can grow in a very dry climate a cover crop, whereas otherwise the cover crop would simply die. And cover crops are really good for lots of reasons, not least if you're in a very dry, arid region, often the soil will have very low organic content. And the one thing that increases organic content and microbial life in the vineyard is plant growth, because the root exudates encourage microbial growth. So there's lots of benefits to thinking like this and having the mid-row irrigation rather than the in-row irrigation. So I don't know whether it will catch off more widely, but it's an interesting idea. Soil composition. I'm fascinated by vineyard soils. I travel 300 days a year to the vineyard areas around the world. I'm fascinated, first of all, by their diversity, and secondly, I'm really intrigued by this idea that you can taste the soil. Not literally, because obviously we know that's not possible, but that different soil types produce wines with different qualities and characteristics. Say, for instance, Pinot Noir and limestone in Burgundy versus Pinot Noir in the Ahr Valley in Germany on slate taste very different. And partially it's climate, yes. But I think there's for instance, in Portugal, if you try Touriga Nacional from the Douro on schist, then try Touriga Nacional from the Dow region on granite, very different expressions. Yes, the actual climate is very different between Dow and the Douro. But actually, if you go to Quinta Val Miau, they're in the Douro, they're in Douro Superior, they have schist, they also have alluvial soils, and they also have some granitic soils, all very close together. And I've tasted their Touriga Nacional from those different soil types, and it tastes wildly different. And I think this is one of the most fascinating things in the world of wine, is how you can taste the differences in the soil type, in the wine. And the mystery is, what is the mechanism that's transmitting these soil type differences? Because obviously it's not the soil itself being taken up by the vines and then causing flavor compounds to mysteriously appear in the grapes. There's a much more interesting biological explanation, but we don't have a clue on it so far. So soil composition is very interesting. The role of soil fertility obviously has a massive effect on the way that the vine grows. Are terroir differences just about drainage and water availability? We know water availability is very important. We know that drainage is important. But what about soil chemistry? And I think these are big unanswered questions. And I think certainly when it comes to fine wine, the small differences between adjoining plots, which can only be explained in terms of the actual composition of the soil, is absolutely fascinating. As a geek, this is one of the things I love the most. So, diseases and pests. Slightly depressing, especially if you own vineyards, but the fact is that Vitis vinifera is extremely susceptible to quite a lot of nasty things that will destroy the grapes or at least reduce the quality. And the first two, obviously, Powdery and Downy mildew, which came to Europe from the United States in the mid to late 19th century, just before phylloxera. Basically, depending on where you are, one or other or both of these will be an issue. And it necessitates some sort of spray. Whether using systemic fungicides or whether using contact fungicides such as copper and sulfur, you're going to need to be in your vineyard, you're going to need to be on top of this, because otherwise you will lose crop and you will lose quality. And there's no way around that. Maybe there's one way around it, but that's something we'll come on to later. Botrytis, obviously a problem in some regions, a big problem. There's also pests like, I was recently in the coastal Alentejo. A friend I know has 60 hectares in the coastal Alentejo, and they've got beautiful vineyards. But this year they've been hammered by Drosophila Suzuki, which is really annoying. So Drosophila is all around, everywhere when you produce wine, you've got little fruit flies, and they're kind of annoying but pretty harmless. But Drosophila Suzuki is a nasty, nasty one because it's able to oviposit, to lay its eggs through grape skins. So it's got a particularly strong ovipositor. So it lays eggs into the grapes, and the eggs produce larvae, and they hatch. And basically what you end up with is a very good-looking vineyard with a nice-looking crop, but then you've got this awful problem of sour rot. And it's just a disaster. And there's nothing much can be done about it. They like red grapes rather than white. So that's one thing. And then Champagne had a massive problem with it a few years ago. So problems like this are really annoying. And the grapevine moth as well. The grapevine moth is a real pest, but this is one of the solutions here. You can see the sexual confusion capsules. If everyone collaborates, and instead of just using insecticides, decides to hang these in their vineyards, over a large area, you can actually deal with the grapevine moth in an intelligent way using biology. And I think this is the way forward. And so I think that this is one of the things that science can really contribute, is if we can find intelligent solutions to some of these problems that don't just involve nuking things with large quantities of chemicals, because that's the old way, and we have to move on from that. Understanding the biology of all these interactions, I think is a massive thing. Then, of course, we've got factors like using companion plants by wildlife refuge areas, so not just planting a huge monoculture, but actually leaving plants in the vineyard that actually act as refuges for beneficial insects, for instance. That can be a real help as well. Just understanding biology gives us clues about how to manage these problems in a way than just otherwise nuking with chemicals, which actually can make the problem worse in the long term. So yields, a little bit about yields. We have this mantra in the wine world that low yields always give better quality, but that's not necessarily true. I think the key is vine balance, but evidently there are yields that do reduce quality, otherwise no one would bother dropping crop or restricting yield, because people aren't stupid, they don't want to lose money. And I know there was a book by a professor from University of California, Davis, a couple of years ago called Terroir and Other Wine Growing Myths. And one of the myths he attacked was this idea that low yields are better than high yields. Ultimately, he was saying there's no relation between yield and quality, but I think that's probably based on an experimental vineyard in the Central Valley in California. But when you go to quality wine regions, people aren't going to, yield is money. People aren't going to just drop crop just because of some naive belief. They will only do it because they know that if they don't, they won't be able to ripen what they've got, and it won't be of as good quality. So there is definitely a relationship between yield and quality, but it's more complicated than just lower is better. There's lots more to be said about that, but I don't want to waste too much time on that. This is a biggie. Climate and climate chaos. And climate chaos is the term that's now being preferred to just climate change, because it implies the urgency with which some of these issues need to be addressed if we're going to change anything. Obviously, climate is a massive factor in terms of wine quality. The fascinating thing about Vitis vinifera is that the different, this is just one species of vine. All the clones and varieties that we know all come from the same species, and yet they're so selective and fussy about where they're grown. You try growing Pinot Noir and the Douro Superior, and it won't end up very well. You won't get great results. Some grapes can only grow within certain narrow climatic zones, and you can measure climate in different ways. Most of the ways that we measure climate, like growing degree of days or the Huelin index or biologically effective growing degree days, are slightly unsatisfying, because I think climate's more complicated than simply how much temperature is there. But we know that the effects of climate change are really being felt very strongly throughout the wine world. Whenever I travel, it's something that people always start talking about. They say, yeah, we've had problems this year, or we had problems last year, or recently it's been less predictable. And this is one of the problems. If we had a slow, gradual change in climate, then it would be possible to adapt by planting new varieties as the vineyards grow older, or by top grafting, or by moving vineyards higher up to cooler climates that previously were too cool, but are now just right. But the problem is not that it's a gradual, small change. It's that we're entering an era where just this massive unpredictability. And there's always been vintage variation, but it seems that every year some new record is being set. And when you travel to wine regions, you see regularly, have abnormal vintages where something is just unprecedented has happened. It's quite common. And you can't plan for that. What you can do, I guess, is hedge your bets. But that costs money. If, for instance, you know that 6 years out of 10 you're going to get a really good vintage in this place, the other 4 maybe not so good, or you plant a range of varieties that this year this one might do really well, this one not so well, you can hedge your bets a little bit. But that has an implicit cost with it, and that's going to make wine more expensive. And then, of course, we've got frost and hail, which sadly you hear more stories of people losing significant portions of their crop to one or the other. Especially in some of the French regions of late. It can be quite depressing going to a wine region just after, in May, just after they've lost 80% of their harvest in late April to frosts. It's, this is the nature of wine growing, is that there's a level of risk and variability, but it seems that a lot of people are having more problems than they did in the past. And soil health, this is such a big one. Something that when I started writing about wine maybe 20 years ago wasn't really discussed as much, but now is a topic that everyone's talking about. There's issues like drainage, compaction. People are thinking about the carbon footprint of managing vineyards. It's all very well being organic, but if that means you have to make 15 more passes through the vineyard with a tractor, then obviously your carbon footprint is higher. So these things all need to be borne in mind. It's not a simple, straight answer. I think what we're realizing now is that soil life is really important. The old-fashioned view where you thought of the crop plant, the vine, and then the soil is just an inert medium that you could nuke with herbicides, that you could compact as much as you wanted, that was just merely, and then you could use any chemical fertilizers you like to replace the stuff that's lost from the soil. I think that old view now, is increasingly outmoded, and now we have to look at an agro-ecosystems approach, where we look at the life of the soil, we look at all the organisms present in the vineyard, and consider this as an agro-ecosystem. And then suddenly we've got a more intelligent view on what's actually happening. And this isn't just in viticulture, I think this is farming more generally. People are realizing that soil is a valuable resource, it's a living thing. It's like, as we walk across the vineyard, it's like the ocean under our feet. We know the ocean. And we know there's lots of life in there. We don't quite know exactly what's there. It's like that with the soil. There's lots of life there. We're walking across it. But there's an ocean under our feet as we walk through our vineyards. Organics and biodynamics, I think, have been very important in viticulture. I think they've made people think very carefully about how they manage their soils. But is that the pinnacle of viticulture, or could we have a form of viticulture that maybe is even better than that, that's scientifically rational, that really thinks very carefully about every input and the life in the soil, the way that the vine responds to that life, and is in some ways more just a better way of doing viticulture that's more locally adapted to the place. I think organics is fantastic, but I don't think there are things about organics that I think are problematic, and I think everyone recognizes that. The high carbon footprint, for instance, of repeated passes through the vineyard because your chemical fungicides, copper and sulfur, which are traditional chemicals, but they're chemicals nonetheless, don't work as well as other alternatives. And then you've got issues with copper, which is not something you really want to be spraying in a vineyard. I'm not saying that organics is bad. I think it's fantastic. It's been really important for viticulture. But can a holistic, intelligent, scientific approach come up with something even better? That's the challenge. Also, there's a lot of talk at the moment about glyphosate. No one had ever heard about glyphosate 3 years ago, unless they knew something about viticulture and farming. But glyphosate now is something that's really, really in the news, and I think it's likely that in many places it will be banned, and that's something that's got to be replaced, because weed control is one of the things that stops many wine growers from going organic. So I think that's something that we need to think about. So intelligent scientific solutions are needed. Microbes. As I said, I think we don't talk enough about microbes. I think yeasts are really interesting. Understanding what happens in a wild ferment, I think, is interesting. When I started writing about wine, it wasn't that long ago, 15, 20 years ago, as somebody who was just getting into wine. I remember that if someone did a wild ferment, a New World producer, it would be on the label. Everyone would go, wild ferment, and everyone would go, whoa, that's crazy, doing a wild ferment. What a crazy thing to do. But now it's pretty commonplace. It's like it's not exceptional. It used to be seen as insanely risky, but now it's something that's quite normal in most cellars around the world. And we're understanding a bit more about what happens in a typical wild ferment. And now you can even buy cultured non-Saccharomyces yeast, which I think is fascinating. It's a really interesting tool. You can do sequential or co-inoculation with non-Saccharomyces yeast along with Saccharomyces, so you can get some of the benefits of wild fermentation without taking some of the risks. So I think this is really interesting. Nutrition, very interesting topic. Could it be that some terroirs are great terroirs because of their nutritional deficiencies that then cause the yeast to struggle a little bit, throw out some volatile sulfur compounds that then get recombined in interesting ways, and then produce something that's in some senses imperfect, but because of its imperfections is actually really interesting. I think this is one of the fascinating questions. It could be that, nutritional deficiency in the must is sometimes something that can actually produce better quality. That's a fascinating idea, and I throw it out there. Fermentation temperature is obviously another thing that I think obviously has a big effect on the outcome of fermentation. So microbial ecology. This is another crazy thing that's happened in recent years. People have been able to take next generation sequencing, so you can get a DNA sequencer now which is about this big. And you can use that to sequence, say for instance, you can go into the vineyard and you can sequence what's there. In the past, when you were looking at microbes, you had to plate them, and so you're almost like selecting the sort of microbes you find. It's a bit like the person looking for their keys under the street lights, It's like it's not because they lost them there, it's because that's where the light is. So in some ways, microbial ecology used to be a bit like that. It's what you could culture would be determining what you find. But now you can just see everything there. And it creates a massive data, and obviously data analysis is the big issue here. But what it's doing is it's helping us to explore the microbials contribution to terroir. For instance, Rhizobium mycorrhizae and that sort of thing. And also the interesting findings that there are yeasts, and we're talking about Saccharomyces here, which people used to think didn't occur in vineyards, that are present in the vineyard, and then which carry out fermentations in the winery. And this is a very interesting area because the winemaking texts in the past used to say that if you've had cultured yeasts in your winery, that every fermentation that then takes place is a cultured strain of yeast. Well, now this can be tested. And there's some very interesting results. In some places where there have been inoculated fermentations in the winery, some people have found that actually it's vineyard strains of Cerevisiae that are doing the fermentation. And it's very interesting because it's people who learn stuff and are expensively educated. When they learn ideas, often they hold those ideas very tightly. And I had some yeast researcher came up to me because I'd written about this in the past based on some work from a New Zealand researcher, and he was very angry with me because I'd written about this because he was convinced that the things he'd learned were true. But actually, this is showing us basically a window into a world that was previously not accessible to us, which is the world of microbiology, and which is intrinsic to wine. And the idea that yeasts present in the vineyard are taking part in fermentations, I think is fascinating. So in the cellar, look, there's some really interesting things happening now. As I travel around the world, I'm seeing, like, in the past, you'd go into a cellar, you'd see stainless steel, and you'd see small oak barrels. It's like, that's modern winemaking. And this would be ubiquitous. But now what we're seeing is ever more producers thinking maybe 225, 228 litre barrels aren't right for my wine. Maybe I'll try a 500 litre barrel. And then you see people trying foudres of 1,000 litres or 3,000 litres. And it's effectively back to the future. So whereas in the past, old wineries would have had these concrete tanks, so people go in and they rip them out and they replace them with stainless steel. Now people are going to buy concrete again. So you've got concrete eggs, or you've got concrete tanks. With their thermal inertia, they're quite good for fermentation, and people are really into them. And we're even seeing terracotta. Obviously the Georgians have a tradition of 8,000 years of making wines in Kvevari, sunk into the ground. But increasingly, people are playing around with terracotta for fermentation. And I was in Portugal a couple of weeks ago in a winery, doing a few days' work there with a friend, and we were filling these old talhas, which is a very large terracotta amphora, and doing fermentations in those. And in November, there's a November the 16th in the Alentejo, there's actually a talha day, which is like where people from all around the world who are making wine in terracotta are getting together and tasting their wines together, which will be really fantastic. I think it's really interesting. Of course, this is a tiny niche, yeah? But I think it's really interesting to see people opening their minds to new ideas and new ways of making wine and thinking just much more creatively. And I think of it like a chef. In the past, winemakers would be like a chef with 2 pans. But now winemakers are like chefs with 14 pans. And some pans are good for some things, and other pans are good for other things. And I think this sort of, the idea of the élevage, the importance of élevage is something that I think people are taking more seriously now. For a long time, it was people who say wine is made in the vineyard, which is kind of true, but actually wine is actually interpreting a terroir as a human activity, and it requires great skill. And the skill of élevage, I think, is one of the skills that we underestimate. I think it's a really important skill indeed. And also, we're talking a lot about the roles of skins. The skin contact is now something that people are doing a lot more of. Yes, it's probably a little bit of a fad, and some of the wines taste more of the process than the place, but I still think it's exciting that people are thinking with more open minds about whether or not skin contact could be an interesting thing for making white wines. And then also people are taking lees more seriously. I think lees are very interesting in wine, and how you use the lees. I think this is a very interesting area. And along those lines, there's a lot more thinking now about the use of stems and whole clusters, especially in red winemaking. And, it used to be the idea that the darker the color of the wine, the better the wine it was. Thankfully, we've moved on from that. We're now in the era of the lighter red wines being celebrated as really interesting wines. I personally love it. If I see a light-colored red wine, I love it. It's like wax. If I see a wax seal on wine, I'll spend more money on that. If I just see a row of wines and the only indication I've got about whether it's good or not is whether it's waxed or not, I'll go for the waxed. Because often it's the natural guys or the more interesting people who are using wax. I say it slightly facetiously, but I love wax, it's brilliant. And it's so nice to see so many wax bottles appearing. But I think lighter red wines are a thing. The market now is very open to the idea that a wine, to be serious, doesn't have to be dark in color. And I think that there's a lot of interesting work going around. What about using whole bunches? What about using this approach where extraction is more like an infusion rather than just mashing the hell out of it, just because you can? Because when you're in a winery, it's one of the most fun things to do is to do a punch down, It's lovely. It's really fantastic. But, maybe not always the best thing for every wine. Questions of ripeness. This is a topic, again, that we could talk about for 20 minutes. I think that one of the definite moves I've seen recently in the world of wine is towards picking earlier. And picking earlier almost always results in better wines, in my experience. There's very few winemakers I speak to, and they said, I really wish I'd picked a bit later. Whereas so often you'll taste the wine and say, oh yeah, we missed the pick a little bit. We should have just got in there a bit earlier, got it fresher. So I think this is a really interesting discussion that maybe we can't have now because of time constraints. For the future, the world of wine is in a state of flux at the moment. There are lots of challenges that we're facing, but a few things I think are worth considering. First of all, hybrids and new varieties. There's amazing genetic resources out there of vines, both the wild vines, Sylvestris, but also the Labruscas and everything else. And there's such a genetic resource that really hasn't been exploited. And certainly it would be fantastic if we could do some intelligent vine breeding and developing new varieties that have got very desirable sensory characteristics, but also which have resistance to powdery and downy mildew, for instance. I think that would be fantastic. Because we don't want to be spraying vineyards the way we're spraying them at the moment. And with marker-assisted selection, for instance, you can do breeding a lot quicker than just crossing and then leaving the vines to produce fruit and then assessing them then. So I think there's lots of genetic techniques could help in this breeding and mining some of the genetic resources that exist out there to produce the great varieties of the future. Genetic modification. Now this is something that I think is a controversial topic, but I think, it's safe. I think we could make some very interesting alterations to some of the existing grape varieties. This is the only way we can keep the existing grape varieties that we love and have disease resistance. Because once you cross varieties, you've lost the variety. So if you want Pinot Noir that's disease resistant, the only way you can do it is by genetic modification. Problem with genetic modification is this. First of all, it's not accepted by consumers. That's a very big hurdle. Secondly, I think it would create a bottleneck. So the cost of doing it would be very high. So you'd find that maybe only 4 or 5 varieties would be genetically modified to be resistant to, which would be quite simple to make them resistant to powdery mildew and downy mildew. And if we did that, then I think we'd have this bottleneck effect where we'd have even more of a concentration on just a few varieties, and lots of the varieties that are really interesting would be lost. So I think it could be a problem. Prospecting for new terroirs, we can use science to find places that as yet aren't planted with grapevines, but which could be brilliant sites for making fine wines. And finally, the question of the social license of wine, something we could go into more, but obviously we take for granted at the moment that wine has this accepted place in society. Wine is at table, you go into a restaurant, you don't get a drinks list, you get a wine list. Wine is seen to be the normal social thing, a desirable thing to have at table. It's got a place in society that we shouldn't take for granted, because unfortunately there are neo-prohibitionists around, people who want to stop us drinking. There's been a big health lobby, certainly in the UK, against smoking. Who would ever have thought, that smoking would be banned in public places in the way that it is now? But it is, and I think now the health lobby have got alcohol in their sights, and so I think the message of the value of wine and its role in society is something that we should start talking more about. Anyway, I've come to the end of my time. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and obviously I'll take questions.
Что ж, спасибо большое, Джейми. Ну что ж, есть ли у нас вопросы в зале? Так, есть вопросы в зале.
Пока Женя понесет микрофон в зал, я немножко Джейми помучаю, если вы позволите.
Давайте.
У нас много будет вопросов, которые будут касаться в первую очередь качества и того, куда оно придет дальше. Смотрите, Джейми. Вопрос простой предельно. Попытаюсь его сформулировать, и потом будет блиц. То есть будет несколько вопросов, на которые вы будете нам отвечать. Хорошо? Смотрите. Проблема натуральности нас беспокоит всех. Поскольку это зарождающаяся новая категория натурального вина, natural wine, в которой смыта граница между качественным и некачественным. Вы говорили о том, что в некоторых винах присутствие брета вполне уместно. Но, как всегда, в вопросах вкуса, а вино – это вкусовщина чистая, то есть мы всегда с вами с трудом договоримся, наверное, друг с другом, кому какое вино понравится, какое вино каждый из нас выберет. При этом вот в этом многообразии вкусов есть некая общность, которая называется глобальным словом «вкус» как стандарт. И вот смотрите, мы с вами оделись сегодня по-разному. Отдай мне кепочку свою, пожалуйста. Мы оделись с вами по-разному совершенно. И тем не менее, у вас нету за спиной каких-нибудь ангельских крыльев, вы не надели колпак, и я его не надел. Если я надену сейчас кепку, что-то не так будет во мне, правда? Может, она мне идет даже, но я не планировал сюда выйти на сцену в таком одеянии, потому что есть некие, наверное, стандарты, которые мы с вами сегодня вкладывали в определение нашего выступления, да, чтобы нам показаться как можно более уместными. Теперь смотрите вопрос. Мне недавно в одном месте в Петербурге, естественно, предложили вино, которое пахнет виски. И я лучше, честно сказать, предпочту хлопнуть виски. Я его понимаю, ценю и люблю. Нужно ли, чтобы вину был сообщен новый вкус? Понятно, что будущее не будет иметь скреп. Понятно, что мы с вами не будем теми же самыми классическими ребятами из 60-х, 70-х, 80-х. Но где граница? Как отличить плохой бред от хорошего? Первый вопрос.
That's a great question. So, first of all, I would say, I'd answer with another question. How do we decide which wines are great and which wines aren't? How do we decide, standards of taste in wine? And the answer I would give is that we have what I call the community of wine. So it's a community decision. So when it comes to wine aesthetics, and we decide together as wine professionals which wines we think are great and which wines we think are bad. Let's take the example of the Douro. Say, for instance, we could do a tasting of 70 Douro wines. And give or take a few outliers, I think most of us would say, we came up with a list of top 10. Most of us would agree which the best wines were. Look at the 2011 Dow Port, for instance, which got quite a high rating from some US publication. Most people would agree that was, first of all, a great vintage for vintage port, and also that was a great example of vintage port. That's uncontroversial, because what we do is we taste together, we talk together, and we have this aesthetic system of fine wine, which, although you can say it's just subjective, that's a silly thing to say, I think, when it comes to wine appreciation, because most of us behave, and it's so many times you'll get a speaker, like we'll say, yes, well, we've got some wines in front of us, but you like what you like, because what matters is which wines you like. And I'm not telling you which wines to like. Well, that's a silly thing, because you probably, as a critic, you're probably selling your tasting notes to people, and so you're saying, well, actually, I don't think it's exactly like what you like. I think there is a role for expertise and authority. And expertise and authority comes up with a verdict which is worth paying for. So we're not saying it's all subjective. What we're saying on your personal level of hedonics, you can like what you like, that's totally fine. Obviously, we go choose what we want to eat at lunchtime, that's fine. But we're not saying that what we choose to eat at lunchtime is normative for other people, whereas with wine criticism we are. So I'm saying you can go and like what you like, it's fine. But when it comes to professionals together, that's what we do. We discuss wines and we say this wine is of greater merit than this wine because of this reason. And that's totally normal behavior. So that's how we're behaving. We're behaving as if there is a level of objectivity of wine criticism, accepting that there are obviously individual differences from one person to another. So along comes natural wine. For me, I think natural wine was one of the most exciting things that happen in the wine world. And I think from 2000 onwards, this movement, it's not an official movement, it's an unofficial alliance of producers who like to get together and taste their wines together. And yes, I know there are problems with the term natural because it implies other wines are unnatural, but that's a side issue. We can just move that to the side for now. What we know is that there has been an explosion of small producers working with interesting patches of wine, often from unfashionable, untrendy regions. And they've brought a lot of life into the world of wine. Some of the wines are a little edgy, they flirt with VA or Brettanomyces. Mousiness has been a huge problem, I think, for people working without any sulfites at all. And mousiness is horrible, unless you're one of the third of the people who can't actually taste mouse in wine. And so, yeah, there's a spread of different quality levels within natural wine. But the best natural wines, I think, are fantastic and are very exciting, and don't show particularly marked levels of any flaw. My point about Brettanomyces was that some of the wines that we know and celebrate as great wines, do have levels of 4EP, which are well above threshold. And so to say that any wine that's got Brett is faulty, which a lot of winemakers do, is to dismiss wines that the community of judgment has said are wines that are worthy of some attention and of some merit. And so I think my problem is with the idea that great winemaking is eliminating all flaws. Last year I was taking part in judging wine in New Zealand, the New Zealand Wine of the Year Awards. The previous year, the same group of judges, who is mainly winemaker-led, had given the overall trophy to a $14 second labeled Pinot Noir, and that's from the whole competition. The New Zealand Wine of the Year, so the Air New Zealand Wine Awards had given their trophy to a second labeled Pinot from Dashwood, which is Vavasor's second label from Marlborough, which retails at about £14. And that's embarrassing for everybody, not least the winery whose second wine was considered to be the best Pinot Noir in all of New Zealand. And it's just like, because what's happening is that the judges were going in there looking for flaws. Now, if you're a winemaker, you need to be able to spot flaws early on in the winemaking process. You need to go into your cellar. Anything a bit suspicious is right, send this off for analysis, and if it's got Brett, then you need to deal with it. But that's not the way it works with finished wines. I think if you have that Brett policeman attitude, you might miss some actually really beautiful wines that have just got the faintest hint of Brettanomyces. Now, I don't like Brettanomyces. If I was making wine, I would really do everything I could to avoid it. But this idea that just because you can spot a fault compound means the wine is faulty, I think is mistaken. And I think, seriously, if you're one of these people that says, oh yeah, natural wines, they're all faulty, it's like, you need to get over it because they're here to stay. And you might not like the idea of natural wines, they're here to stay. It's a very invigorating area of the wine world. And I have real fights with some of my colleagues in the UK who are anti-natural wine, because you go to a wine fair, one of these natural wine fairs, there's two of them happen in London every year. I've been to one in Montreal as well. They happen all over the place. And you will see lots of people in their 20s enjoying wine, right? And that's good, because the wine of the world, normally it's guys in their 50s who are enjoying the wines, But I'd love seeing people in their 20s getting into wine and exploring wine. And it's just
Джейми, thank you. Спасибо большое. Просто я прошу прощения, у нас много к вам вопросов, очень. Они сыпятся у нас там на экранах, и здесь вот молодой человек уже готов задать еще вопрос, чтобы всем дать, или многим, по крайней мере, всем не получится дать возможность высказаться. Мы вас чуть-чуть поторопим. Спасибо.
Добрый день. Я хочу задать вопрос по поводу новых технологий выращивания, такие как гидропоника, аэропоника, фокпоника, если вы знаете. Вот. Как вы считаете, насколько данные технологии имеют место быть в сфере виноделия? Ведь эти методы выращивания позволяют создать максимально искусственные условия по типу нужный свет, нужная минерализация. Все можно воссоздать, и есть ли кто-то, кто экспериментирует сейчас?
Вы точно про виноград сейчас говорили? Спасибо. Джейми.
Yes, yes, like a grow-op for wine grapes, yeah. No, I think people aren't doing that because it's too expensive. And vineyards do quite a good job of it, and very cheaply as well. So I think it's interesting from an experimental point of view. We could do some really interesting experiments. But I think the fact that the vine it takes 3 years to produce its first crop, and it just means that it's actually very difficult to do that sort of work. Although it would be you could answer some really interesting questions using that sort of technology.
Давай тогда с экрана, Жень, почитаем.
Спасибо.
вопрос.
Да, с экранов сейчас мы зададим вопрос. Так, Джейми, один из вопросов, я думаю, вы видите сейчас на экране.
Minerality, yeah. Minerality is a fascinating topic. Do you know what I think is that often when we use the term mineral, it's almost like a symbolic code language sort of way of talking about wine. So what we're not saying is that there are actual minerals in wine that we're tasting. It's just like I taste something and I think, oh, that's kind of mineral. It's like if you taste an old wine, you say, oh, it's leathery. You're not saying it's got leather in the wine. You don't end up having symposia looking at leather in wine. The problem with minerality is because minerality is a picture language, people think there's also a scientific physical correlate with something in the wine, and then they start having seminars on minerality in wine. And I just don't think there's a signature. I think there's two, often people mean different things by minerality. One is the textural thing, a textural quality of minerality, and then there's also that smell, sort of slightly reductive matchstick, gunflint sort of mineral smell. And so some people mean by the smell of minerality, other people mean by the texture. And other people just use minerality because they've run out of words to say about the wine. So they taste a wine, they go, it's really good, yeah, it's quite mineral. So I think this is a very interesting area, but I don't think there's a precise answer yet.
Да, спасибо. Так, вот у нас есть еще вопросы из зала. Так, Артур Саксян, ваш вопрос уже задавал Даниор из Ростова про российское виноделие. Да. Когда обед? Он попозже немножечко будет у нас. Так, а вот Екатерина, прошу.
Спасибо большое. Здравствуйте. Меня зовут Екатерина, Гинза Project, Санкт-Петербург. Я хотела спросить такую штуку. Всегда, когда приезжаешь на винодельню, тебя ведут на виноградники, в первую очередь на участки там, со старыми лозами. И виноделы очень гордятся этим. Вот, мол, старые лозы, с них у нас самые лучшие, самые топовые вина. Но недавно я начала углубляться в этот вопрос, начала изучать и наткнулась на исследование, в котором говорится о том, что действительно вино с более старых лоз получается лучше, чем с молодых, но до какого-то определенного возраста, а именно до примерно 20 лет. А именно, получается, разница между вином с 10-летних лоз и 20-летних, она есть, а между 20-летними лозами и 50-летними уже разницы нет. Вот что вы об этом думаете? Это маркетинг? Это все-таки попытка просто продать какие-то вина дороже, чем другие? Или вот что вы думаете об этом? Спасибо.
Great question. I think that couple of things. Once, if you find a 50-year-old vineyard, there's a confounder here, which is that obviously for somebody to accept the lower yields of a 50-year-old vineyard, it must be an exceptional vineyard to start off with. So sometimes what we see with old vines is we're seeing, say for instance, Sylvaner in Alsace. No one's planted that for the last 50 years. So all Alsace Sylvaner knows old vine by definition. And it's fantastic. It's really good. But you don't know whether, so it must have been performing really well in a good vineyard site, otherwise people would have ripped it out. So I think definitely when I speak to people, it depends on the variety and it depends on the region, but they say you start seeing what a site is capable of after maybe 10 years, and then you see at 20 years, you see by that stage you see another step up in terms of the quality. But I think your point is a valid one. Between 20 and 70, do you see a benefit? What is the vine got at age 70 that it didn't have at age 20? And so I think that the main step up in quality would be those, I think, first 20 years. But it will depend on the variety, the way the vineyard is managed, the soil type, and obviously what you do with the grapes when you harvest them. But I think maybe the other thing is that people who, when they have a 70-year-old vineyard, they cherish it and they do better things with the grapes. So that's another confounder there as well. It's like you're not going to, you're going to take that vineyard more seriously simply because it's old. So I think it's a really interesting question. Yeah.
К сожалению, время наше неизбежно подошло к концу, и я хочу поблагодарить за то, что вы сегодня в первую очередь продемонстрировали, что для того, чтобы собрать в зале около 1000 человек, не обязательно ждать группу «Ленинград», а можно проявить интерес действительно к человеку, который очень много знает с научной точки зрения и с глобальной точки зрения. Мне это был Джейми. Спасибо большое.